Yeah, one of the questions I had was about this interaction between the ecological functions of the roof and the green aspects, and then also their social functions, because I feel like we've seen a lot of business cases that were at least implicitly focused on wealthier areas or wealthier clientele. And then, for example, the example that you showed, David, with St. Hagen, that's an area that's relatively well off. I'm not from Oslo, but my sense is that it's relatively well off. So it may be an area that has a low level of green infrastructure, but a higher level of social infrastructure, if you want to call it that. So I guess if anybody has comments on that, because the green roofs, as we heard from Helena, they're also important for creating social arenas. So finding the areas where there are also these social cold spots in the city and what function they can provide there.
I feel that's questions to me. It's maybe more on this end.
I'd love to respond on that. I think to your question, 2 of the case studies that I showed today are a good example. The first one is Østerbro in Copenhagen. When I was working on that rooftop, I worked alongside volunteers, which were supported by the government as they were going through food disorder challenges. Also other people paying their time with social input to garden on that rooftop. And it's a community-supported agriculture model. So those community members then can volunteer on the roof. And when you look at comparing the price of the food box, it's not an elite price market. It's the same price you pay for other food boxes that are offered in the city. But of course, it's not financially viable for that project to only go off of government grants and to host only those community and social aspects, which is why pairing that rooftop with the kitchen and the dinners in the greenhouse, I think would make that project a real success. The other example, which I think is useful to look again at, is the Gary Comer Center, which is actually on the south side of Chicago in quite a rough neighborhood. And there's a lot of concern about the opportunities which are available for those children. And incorporating that roof garden gives a potential for a bright after school time to engage with food production and to have a fun, safe, and green after-school time.
I think we also need to revert back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs that most of us have had contact with at some point. In Norway, we're so well off, and we don't really have any problems. So, on the larger scale of things. So it's a lot about self-realization and about exploring new hobbies and finding new things. But when we see across the world, it's very different interest. I mean, after the financial crisis in Southern Europe, urban gardening became just a way to afford food. So we have to recognize that Scandinavia is in a very unique position, but also within Scandinavia, or within Norway or within Oslo, we can be split up into many segments that have very different needs. And I think the need for a job will emerge as a key driver for these things. What are the green jobs for the 2/3 of the population that do not have a university degree? And can this be an arena to create those jobs? And then we are fulfilling additional sets of social needs that we need to figure that out, simply.
First of all, thank you for all the presentation. They were extremely inspiring and good. I've worked for a large construction company, and I was wondering, the vast majority of ideas or examples which were shown today are oriented to flat roofs. But there are many, conventional inclined roofs on existing buildings, and also like the new buildings we build, they very often have like those conventional roofs. Are there any innovations, good ideas, suggestions which can be implemented on those projects when it comes to urban ecology?
It's not generally advised to install a green roof on a slope more than 15%. It's just not so natural to place a landscape on this slope. It makes the irrigation a bit of a challenge, as well as there's a potential for a landslide coming down that roof. There is some technology where you have kind of like a stepped frame system, so that you can hold in, every let's say 50 centimeters or so to protect against a landslide. So it can be done, and you can see a lot of projects. I've seen a lot of projects in Denmark that use a sloped roof, also in Germany. And I think moving forward, if you really want to look into that, I would say you kind of can save yourself some foreseen problems by incorporating a thicker substrate, so that the plants can really root down into the soil, and that helps protect against the landslide.
Also, here in Norway, we have 1,000 years, or in Scandinavia, 1,000 years experience in having green roofs on tilted roofs. We've been doing that for a long, long time. I was talking to Harald yesterday about the presentation, and he's a medieval historian, and he was telling me that the first copper etching that exists of Bergen, all the buildings have green roofs on it, and one of them has a goat on top of that green roof. But I think it would be even be more useful to bring in Nittedal. Morten, maybe you want to say something about the rooftop, some of your inclined rooftops?
Well, we have been doing green roofs for about 32 years now, and also mostly on sloped roof. The last maybe 10, 15 years, there's more like a urbanization of the greenery in all, but there's no problem using green roofs on sloped roofs up to 30 degrees. That's our experience.
Yeah, so this is a question about ownership of the roofs and the low-hanging fruits. So today the ownership is divided between three significant parties. It's the public roofs, and then the business roofs, and then the private roofs. And where are the low-hanging fruit? And what is the mix? What is the mix? Is it 50% this and 30% that?
I mean, I think just based on what other cities have managed to do, the lower hanging fruit that tends to be the publicly owned properties, and I think that's why you see a lot of, so in the examples I showed before, for example, Portland, first of all, leading by example, and then mandating by example, and finally introducing this to privately owned properties, because it's just easier to do stuff on properties that are publicly owned. Of course, then there's the funding question. Finance needs to come from somewhere, but I would say that publicly owned properties are the lower hanging fruit generally. What was the second part of your question was about the split of? Yeah. Did you mean like how much of the roof should be green, or?
No. The question is. How much the publics, the business roofs and the private roofs? What is typical in an urban city like Oslo? Is it 33.3% on each of those? The potential. This is the potential in total.
Do you mean how much property is privately owned in Oslo?
Yeah. How much is privately owned, and how much is business owned, and how much is public owned?
Does anyone know that actually?
Response though, from a sort of ecological economist's point of view, the way you might answer that question is looking at how much, in relative terms, the public, private, and the business roofs would cover these gaps in ecosystem service delivery in the city. And if you had a limited budget, you would allocate that budget based on how much they do for the city. So it wouldn't be a three-way split. It would be graded by where these roofs are and what potential they have structurally to deliver actually a suite of functions or ecosystem services. But that's a sort of technocratic economist point of view. I have a question which is kind of comes off your question. Do you think, if you think like planners or put your head in a planning state of mind, do you think it makes sense for Oslo as a city to try to offer incentives prioritizing across all three types of ownership, or should one focus and prioritize within ownership groups because they're so different? Anybody take that? Yeah.
I think it was interesting that Kilai brought up the health sector as an important sector for green roofs. Because we've seen it from the data we've been looking at, they have maybe the most concrete cost benefit of it, because people get well quicker if they, like, there's so many studies now that looking outside at a green wall will make you well again quicker than if you were looking at concrete. So I'm sure as the health sector is more and more pushed for strapping their budgets, this will come in as something that will save them money in terms of hospital nights. So it's not even a cost, it's a cost-cutting strategy. So maybe you have some additional info on that?
There's actually a lot of really good examples already of horticultural therapy gardens on hospitals. And please take a look at the fact sheet for hospital rooftop gardens. I think I have on there a list of 6 or so more in North America, Europe, and also in Asia. So plenty of examples to see how it can be incorporated.
The food has arrived, I think. But I'd have one question, or rather you had an unanswered question, Eleanor, about the other category, ecosystem services that planners should be planning on, which aren't on this list.
I think the first question from the audience here kind of spoke to my my idea for an other, which would be looking at who's living in which social demographics you have in different parts of the city, and hence who is actually benefiting the new green areas that you're creating benefiting from these new green areas. So I think the project on this roof sounds like it's an example of one that's having giving benefits to a fairly diverse group. But yeah, some of those factors maybe could come into your map at some point, which is very impressive, by the way.